there's something strange about the silence of the night. When the world slows and our thoughts begin to drift, not to the noise of our busy lives, but to the mysteries that linger just beneath the surface of time. This is a story, not just of a man who became the richest in modern history, but of a shadow that loomed over the Gilded Age, shaping the very bones of America's empire of industry. Tonight, we travel back to an era of soot-covered streets and flickering gas lamps, to a time when carriages ruled the roads and oil had just begun to glisten beneath the soil. In the hush of this evening, I invite you to settle in. Perhaps you're lying in bed, the light of your screen the last glow before sleep finds you. Or maybe you're somewhere quiet, nestled in a blanket, hoping to drift off with something timeless on your mind. Because tonight, we step into the life of John Davison Rockefeller, a man both revered and reviled. A titan who built not only an empire of oil, but an empire of influence so vast, so calculating, that even now, over a century later, his legacy threads through our lives. But behind the fortune, there was a boy born to a snake oil salesman. There was a teenager selling potatoes door to door. There was a young man with ink-stained fingers, writing ledgers late into the night. And behind every grand move, Standard Oil, the antitrust trials, the gilded philanthropy, there were choices. Quiet, powerful choices that shaped the world in ways few ever truly understood. As you listen, feel no need to stay alert. Let the rise and fall of Rockefeller's tale soothe you like the slow turning of an old book's pages. Let your breath slow, your thoughts wander. Let this story become the river that carries you gently into sleep. But before we begin, I'd love to know, from where in the world are you watching this story? Is it evening where you are, or the quiet hush of early morning? Feel free to share in the comments. I read each one, and your presence means more than you know. And if you find peace in these stories, consider subscribing or simply giving this video a like, so we can continue walking through history together, one quiet night at a time. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. Before the towers, before the ledgers, before the name Rockefeller became synonymous with unfathomable wealth, there was only a boy born in the quiet chill of a late July morning in 1839, in the small rural town of Richford, New York, a place so modest the world might have never known it existed if not for him. The house he was born in was wooden, plain, and perched atop a patch of land that bore the scent of pine and dry hay. Chickens scratched in the dirt. The wind pushed gently through cracked windows, and the floorboards creaked when walked upon. It was not a home of luxury, but neither was it one of misery. It was, like many American homes of the time, a place of hard work, strong faith, and unspoken tension. John Davison Rockefeller was the second of 6 children, born to William Avery Rockefeller and Eliza Davison Rockefeller, 2 people as opposite as oil and water. His father, Bill, known to many around town as Devil Bill, was a smooth-talking, mustachioed man with a glint in his eye and a bottle in his coat. He claimed to be a doctor, though the truth was far murkier. He sold miracle cures, bottles of useless tonic, always on the move, always slipping from town to town before suspicion caught up. He'd vanish for weeks, even months, and when he returned, it was often with money of mysterious origin and tailies no one quite believed. Young John learned early that his father was not a man to trust. But he also learned something else: charm, persuasion, the way a man could bend others with just a tone of voice or a certain confidence in his step. He watched his father closely, not out of admiration, but out of caution. And in those lessons, wrapped in distrust, he developed the first seeds of cunning. But it was Eliza, his mother, who shaped the boy's soul. She was a woman of steel-bound discipline and devout Baptist faith. Her world was one of Bible readings, quiet thrift, and endless work. She believed every cent should be accounted for, every meal earned. She taught her children that willful waste makes woeful want. When John came home with a single penny, she'd make him explain where it came from, how he got it, and what he intended to do with it. From Eliza, Rockefeller inherited his fierce sense of responsibility. From Bill, he inherited wariness and perhaps ambition. As a child, John was quiet and observant. He did not run wildly in the fields like his brothers. He liked stillness. He liked structure. He found joy in organizing, in saving. One of his first delights was a small, handmade ledger where he would note down every coin earned and spent, while other boys bartered marbles or played with twine-bound kites. John tracked his pennies like a banker. By age 7, he was doing chores for neighbors to earn small bits of money, hauling potatoes, digging ditches, setting fence posts. It was hard work, and he did it without complaint. Each task completed added to his growing sense of self. He began lending money to his brothers with interest. He started planning what others ignored. Even then, he was building something, brick by invisible brick. He once said, later in life, "From the beginning, I was trained to work, to save, and to give." The first two came naturally. The last, that would take time. The family moved often. The soil of Richford was thin and the opportunities thinner. Eventually, in 1853, they settled in Strongsville, Ohio, just outside Cleveland. It was here, amidst the industrial rumblings of a growing city, that John's young mind began to stir with bigger dreams. But even in his youth, life was not easy. His father's absences became more frequent, and rumors whispered through the neighborhood. There were affairs, there were arrests, and there were moments when the family was left with nothing but Eliza's iron will to hold them together. Still, Rockefeller's world was more than dysfunction. There was a garden where he planted beans, a dog named Jack who followed him through town. There were Sunday sermons where he listened to preachers speak of sin, salvation, and destiny. These moments wrapped around him like threads, each one binding a part of his growing identity. It's easy to think of John D. Rockefeller only as the billionaire. But at night, when the world dims and our minds wander, we begin to see things differently. We see a boy, eyes fixed on the flicker of a candle, carefully counting the coins in his tin box. We see the loneliness of a quiet child, wondering why his father disappears, why the other boys seem so carefree. We see a mind already measuring the world, calculating its rules, its winners and losers, its prices and its promises. In these early years, the future was not yet written. He was not yet powerful, not yet feared, not yet rich. He was only a boy, standing on the dusty threshold of possibility, holding his breath. And in that breath, something began to take shape. A hunger, not for fame, not for gold, but for control. Control of his life, control of his fate, and one day, perhaps, control of far more than he ever dared speak aloud. But to get there, he would need more than thrift and ambition. He would need the world to open a door. That door would open in Cleveland, and it would be covered in oil. The move to Cleveland was quiet and unceremonious. No parades welcomed the Rockefeller family. No headlines announced the arrival of a future tycoon. It was just another family shifting westward, joining the slow, hopeful tide of Americans searching for stability, for work, for something more. For John, still a teenager, it was a silent moment, one of those quiet relocations that seem small at the time, but echo down through a lifetime. Cleveland, in the 1850s, was not yet the industrial giant it would become, but the signs were there. The city hummed with the energy of expansion. Men with soot-stained hands laid rail lines, mills clanged through the day and night, and storefronts lined the muddy streets like a procession of ambition. It smelled of wood smoke and progress. This was a place where a boy with careful hands and a mind for detail could, perhaps, rise. Rockefeller enrolled at Folsom's Commercial College, a practical business school that taught young men the cold, efficient mechanics of commerce, double entry, bookkeeping, penmanship, arithmetic. These weren't grand philosophical subjects, they were trades. But John loved them. He took to accounting like a pianist to the keys. There was something in the neat columns, the clean addition, the absolute truth of numbers that gave him comfort. In a world where fathers disappeared and money came and went, numbers remained. They didn't lie. They didn't change their minds. He studied relentlessly. And soon, the time came to find work. At 16, John began knocking on doors across Cleveland's business district, dressed in a neat black coat, his shoes polished, a small sheaf of recommendations in his hand. It was 1855, and the economy wasn't kind. Offices turned him away one after another. Days passed, then weeks. Still, he kept walking. Finally, on September 26th, after weeks of rejection, A firm called Hewitt and Tuttle, wholesalers in grain, meat, and other commodities, gave him a chance. He was offered a position as assistant bookkeeper at a starting salary of $16 per month. John would remember that date for the rest of his life. He called it Job Day and celebrated its anniversary each year more than even his birthday, because to him, that was the true beginning. Not when he was born, but when he became useful. In that office, he worked with religious discipline. He arrived early, left late, copied ledgers with careful script, and never wasted ink. He became known for his precision. Every cent matched, every decimal aligned. He asked for more work when others relaxed. He began to understand supply chains, margins, credit lines, and seasonal flux. The men above him began to notice. But Rockefeller's mind did not stop at the walls of Hewitt and Tuttle. He was watching the wider city, the canals, the grain flows, the coming of the railroads. He was learning that the real money was not in bookkeeping. It was in movement, in volume, in control of goods. After just 3 years, he decided to leave. Not out of impatience, but calculation. He had saved $800, a small fortune for a young man in his late teens, and borrowed another $1,000 from his father, with interest. With this seed money, he formed a partnership with another young man, Morris B. Clark, and entered the produce business under the firm Clark and Rockefeller. Their strategy was simple, but elegant. They would buy goods wholesale, grain, meat, hay, and sell them to a growing Cleveland market. Rockefeller oversaw the books, and slowly, steadily, the business grew. But there was something different about John, even then. Most young businessmen chased profit with frenzy. They took risks. They speculated. They talked loud and gestured big. Rockefeller didn't. He spoke softly, calculated carefully, and held his emotions close. His competitors called him cold. But those close to him saw something else. They saw that John D. Rockefeller believed in compound effort. Every dollar saved wasn't just savings. It was a tool, a soldier in his long campaign. He once said, "Do not many of us who fail to achieve big things fail because we lack concentration, the art of concentrating the mind on the thing to be done at the proper time, and to the exclusion of everything else." Even as a young man, he was building his fortress, not in stone, but in restraint. He lived modestly, even as his wealth grew. He walked to work, ate simple meals, saved and reinvested. And more importantly, he kept his gaze forward, not on the comforts of the moment, but on what might come next. And that next was nearing. Because in the early 1860s, word began to spread. A dark, thick substance had been bubbling out of the ground in Pennsylvania. Something that could be burned for light, refined into fuel, even used in machinery. It was messy, unpredictable, and surrounded by chaotic speculation. They called it petroleum. Black gold. Most people saw a frenzy. Rockefeller saw a formula. He didn't race to the fields like so many others. He didn't buy drilling land or chase gushers. Instead, he observed, he measured, and he came to a singular, calm conclusion. The real money was not in drilling. It was in refining, turning the crude into something useful, something stable, something scalable. While others dreamed of oil wealth, Rockefeller started planning how to organize it. And so, by 1863, he would begin the first quiet steps into oil. A small refinery, a cautious investment, but with that decision, the course of American industry and Rockefeller's destiny would begin to shift. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. But like a tide slowly rising, he moved. By the time his competitors realized it, he was already 10 steps ahead. Because to Rockefeller, ambition wasn't fire, it was arithmetic. Quiet, steady, patient arithmetic. And the equation was just beginning to unfold. Next, we enter the world of oil. The fields, the flame, and the first empire hidden beneath Cleveland's skies. By the time the smoke began to curl from Cleveland's chimneys in the early 1860s, the city was already changing. Rail lines crisscrossed its edges like veins of iron, connecting its factories to the outer world. The Cuyahoga River, sluggish and brown, wound its way through the heart of the city, dragging commerce with it: grain, lumber, pork, and now barrels of oil. The war between North and South had broken out, and like all wars, it brought with it both ruin and opportunity. Factories boomed. Demand surged. Money flowed swiftly through the hands of those who could meet the needs of a nation in conflict. And into this whirlpool stepped John D. Rockefeller, not with noise, not with flash, but with something far more powerful: control. At this point, Rockefeller was still young, only in his early 20s, but there was something behind his eyes that set him apart. While others looked at the surface, he was always peering deeper, calculating long arcs, finding patterns in what looked like chaos. He was still running the produce commission business, Clark and Rockefeller, when he first began to eye the oil industry. It was, to many, a gambler's game. The oil strikes in Titusville, Pennsylvania, had launched a wave of frenzied speculation. Wells were dug recklessly, fortunes made and lost in a single day. Barrels leaked, prices soared and crashed. It was a wild, unruly scene, precisely the kind Rockefeller distrusted. But he watched closely. He noted how crude oil, though easy to find, was useless until it was refined. And the refining process, dirty, smoky, complex, was still in its infancy. There was waste. There was loss. There was no standard, no system. And so, he thought, that's where the opportunity lay, not in the drama of discovery, but in the quiet logic of transformation. With partners, including Samuel Andrews, a chemist with refining experience, Rockefeller took a cautious step. In 1863, they opened a small refinery in Cleveland's Flats, where the Cuyahoga twisted beneath the industrial skyline. The refinery was named Andrews, Clark and Company, and John, true to form, managed the books. The early work was harsh. Oil stank. It stuck to the skin. The fires needed tending around the clock. Leaks were common. Workers coughed in the smoke and slipped in pools of pitch. But Rockefeller did not flinch. He studied every detail, how the barrels were filled, how the waste was disposed of, how much light the kerosene gave off, how long it took to cool. He was not content to simply operate a refinery. He wanted to perfect it. He focused on efficiency with monastic devotion. Every drop wasted was money lost. Every unnecessary step was an enemy. He demanded better practices, safer tools, tighter record keeping. He insisted on reinvesting profits, no luxuries, no speculation, no flash. And while others burned money trying to strike oil, Rockefeller made money by refining it better than anyone else. He also began to understand the critical value of transportation. Crude oil had to be hauled in, refined oil shipped out. Railroads were essential, but their pricing was arbitrary. Powerful rail barons like Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled the flow of goods with an iron fist, raising and lowering rates as they pleased. Most refiners were at their mercy, but not Rockefeller. He believed in leverage, in scale, and so he began negotiating with railroads, not as a customer, but as a partner. He offered volume in exchange for lower rates. He promised consistency, reliability, and enormous traffic. His competitors called it unfair, but Rockefeller saw it as strategy. Those discounted rates, the infamous rebates, became one of his sharpest weapons. With every dollar saved, he undercut the competition, and with every small refinery he outcompeted or absorbed, his empire grew. By the late 1860s, Rockefeller had bought out Clark, leaving the original partnership behind. In its place, he established a new firm, Rockefeller and Andrews. It would soon become the largest refinery in Cleveland and one of the largest in the world. But still, it wasn't enough. Because John didn't just want to be rich. He wanted order. He looked out at the oil industry and saw chaos. Dozens of small, inefficient refiners competing on razor-thin margins, duplicating efforts, flooding the market, burning through resources. It offended his sensibilities. He believed deeply that business should be systematic, efficient, unified. He once wrote, "The day of combination is here to stay. Individualism has gone, never to return." And so he began to plan something bigger, not just a business, a structure, a machine where every gear turned in harmony, where waste was eliminated, where every dollar moved with purpose. And at the center of it all, he would sit quietly, steadily, unseen, but controlling everything. That vision would take form soon enough. But for now, Rockefeller remained in Cleveland, working long hours in a modest office, poring over ledgers, studying barrels, building alliances, and preparing for something the world had not yet imagined, a single entity that would refine, transport, and sell the majority of the world's oil. Not with chaos, but with discipline. Not with greed, but with system. And though the fires of his refinery glowed through the Cleveland night, and though the city hummed with the din of progress, very few noticed the quiet man walking home each evening in a dark coat, his head slightly bowed, calculating silently. But they would, oh, they would, because something vast was coming, and it would soon have a name. Standard Oil. They called it black gold. It oozed from the earth with a thick, bitter scent, part sulfur, part smoke, part something altogether unknown to the farmers and laborers of Titusville, Pennsylvania. It first seemed like a nuisance, a sticky, sludgy thing that fouled wells and dirtied shoes. But when Colonel Edwin Drake drilled that first successful well in 1859, the world tilted slightly on its axis, because this dark, viscous substance could be refined. And when it was, it burned bright. Kerosene, cleaner than whale oil, more efficient than candles, and suddenly indispensable. What followed was not progress, but chaos. Oil towns sprouted overnight, like wildflowers after a storm. Dirt roads churned into mud, hammered by wagon wheels hauling heavy barrels. Makeshift derricks crowded every patch of promising soil, sometimes exploding in bursts of fire or collapsing into their own foundations. Men arrived by the thousands, chasing fortunes with pickaxes and dreams. Fistfights broke out over mineral rights. Saloons lined the streets. Oil speculators called wildcatters made and lost fortunes before breakfast. It was an American fever, raw and roaring, the kind of moment that tempts young men and swallows old ones. John D. Rockefeller watched it all from Cleveland, 300 miles away. He didn't go to Titusville. He didn't need to. He saw what others missed. The oil itself wasn't the prize. The real power came after, in turning crude into something useful, in transporting it, bottling it, selling it better, faster, cleaner than anyone else. And he also saw the future flickering, just barely, in the distance. He saw oil not just as fuel for lamps, but for machines, for engines, for factories, for ships, even war. The applications were endless, the infrastructure not yet in place. So Rockefeller built it. He took his small Cleveland refinery and expanded it methodically. He invested in better equipment, experimented with chemistry, studied every aspect of the refining process. He demanded that waste be captured, reused, repurposed. Gasoline, a byproduct others discarded, was stored. Lubricants were bottled. Even the sludge, thick, foul residue was sold for paving roads. No scrap was worthless in his hands. Where others burned profits chasing wells, Rockefeller turned efficiency into empire. And then he began to consolidate. Cleveland was full of small refiners, dozens of them, each trying to survive in a volatile market. Prices swung wildly. Supply chains broke down. Transportation was unreliable. Most of these operators had neither Rockefeller's patience nor his financial discipline. He approached them quietly. He offered to buy them out, not aggressively, but firmly. He'd show them his ledgers, prove how little they were making, how close they were to ruin. Many agreed. Those who resisted found their suppliers drying up, their transport rates mysteriously rising, their businesses faltering. And slowly, one by one, he folded them into his growing operation. By 1870, he was ready to give it a name. Standard Oil. The word standard was chosen carefully. It conveyed reliability, consistency, trust. It was a promise to customers. This oil would be clean. This kerosene would burn evenly. This price would remain stable. In a chaotic industry, Standard Oil offered order. And it worked. Within a few years, Standard Oil controlled nearly all refining in Cleveland. Then Pittsburgh. Then Philadelphia. Then New York. He moved not in great leaps, but with relentless precision. Step by step, he created what few in business had ever dared to imagine, a monopoly born not from flash, but from optimization. By the mid-1870s, Rockefeller controlled more than 90% of the oil refined in the United States. And yet, few outside the industry even knew his name. He remained a private figure. He rarely spoke in public. He avoided journalists. His home life was modest. He didn't build castles or throw parties. He walked to work. He prayed before meals. He counted every cent. But make no mistake, behind that quiet exterior was a ruthless strategist. He believed in the Darwinian philosophy of business, survival of the fittest and the most efficient. Competitors were not enemies, but obstacles. Emotions had no place in commerce. Everything was calculation, and oil was only the beginning. With the profits from Standard Oil, Rockefeller began expanding his reach into distribution, marketing, and transportation. He built his own barrel factories, owned rail cars, secured storage tanks along major ports. He didn't just refine oil, he controlled it from the ground to the lamp. But in doing so, he also made enemies. Small businessmen accused him of crushing competition. Farmers accused him of raising rail prices by securing secret deals. Politicians grew suspicious. Journalists whispered. And yet, his grip only tightened. Because John D. Rockefeller didn't rise by chasing wealth. He rose by engineering a system where wealth would come to him inevitably, predictably, endlessly. As the 1870s drew to a close, Standard Oil stood as a quiet, unstoppable force. Its name etched into train cars, its barrels stacked like pyramids at every port. Its refined kerosene lighting homes from New York to San Francisco, even shipping overseas. And the man at the center of it all, still calm, still disciplined, still watching. He once wrote, "The ability to deal with people is as purchasable a commodity as sugar or coffee. And I will pay more for that ability than for any other under the sun." Rockefeller wasn't chasing oil anymore. He was mastering human nature. And as he stepped into the next decade, his plans would expand far beyond refineries and barrels. He had seen what power looked like, and now he wanted to shape it. By 1870, the name Standard Oil had begun to whisper its way into the ledgers and corridors of power, not with clamor, but with consequence. It was the year Rockefeller formally incorporated the company. A signature on paper, a small office in Cleveland, a humble name. But within it, something unprecedented had taken root. This was not just a company. It was a philosophy, a new way of seeing business, not as a series of transactions, but as a total system. John D. Rockefeller didn't want to participate in the oil industry. He wanted to organize it. And so he began. Where most men focused on the product, on barrels, on wells, on the gleaming flame of kerosene, Rockefeller focused on the process. His genius was not invention. It was integration. Quietly, he built an empire across every link of the chain. He bought the barrel makers, ensuring his supply was cheaper than any rivals. He acquired warehouses and storage tanks. He purchased rail cars and negotiated bulk shipping rates with the railroad barons, rates that no competitor could touch. Then came the delivery systems, agents, storefronts, distribution hubs, all feeding into a growing network that only Standard Oil controlled. It was an industrial web. And at its center, Rockefeller sat watchful, unshakable, precise. By consolidating the refining process, Standard Oil made kerosene cheaper and cleaner than ever before. The public benefited, whether they knew it or not. A bottle of light that once cost $1 now sold for half that price. Cities gleamed brighter. Shops stayed open later. Homes across America flickered with steady, affordable flame. But those within the oil industry saw something else entirely. They saw themselves being erased. Standard Oil didn't compete. It consumed. Smaller firms were given two choices: sell out or be crushed. The choice was often made in back rooms, over ink-stained contracts. Sometimes, Rockefeller would send trusted men to speak for him, never with threats, but with facts. They'd open their books and show the truth. Your margins are thinning. Your debts are rising. Your suppliers are ours. Your future uncertain. And many accepted. Why fight the tide when you could float with it? Others resisted. And those who did found themselves locked out, unable to ship oil, unable to buy barrels, unable to stay afloat. Their protests echoed through the halls of government, but Rockefeller moved faster than the law could follow. There were no antitrust statutes then. Monopoly, as an idea, was still undefined. To him, it was not aggression. It was efficiency. He believed that competition, while romantic in theory, was destructive in practice. Too many companies duplicated effort. Too many businessmen operated on ego and emotion. He offered them a better way: order, consistency, and yes, profit, but under his structure. And while Cleveland remained the company's beating heart, Rockefeller's reach stretched across the continent. In 1874, he created a powerful subsidiary, the South Improvement Company, which, through secret deals, secured special rebates and transportation advantages with major railroads. These deals were devastating. Standard Oil could ship its barrels at a fraction of the price competitors paid. And worse, it received kickbacks on the shipments of its rivals. When news of this arrangement leaked, fury erupted. Independent refiners called meetings. The public protested. Newspapers ran scathing editorials. The deal collapsed under the pressure of scandal, and the South Improvement Company was dissolved. But the damage was already done. Rockefeller had used that window to cripple his competition and further consolidate the industry. And when the storm passed, he quietly picked up the pieces. By the close of the 1870s, Standard Oil controlled more than 90% of U.S. oil refining. Think of that. Not 10%, not 50%, 90%. It was an empire without borders, without kings, without parades. Its territory was measured in tank cars and silent contracts. Its army wore suits. Its conquest came in ledgers. And still, the man behind it rarely spoke. John D. Rockefeller avoided speeches. He offered few interviews. His face rarely appeared in print. Even among employees, he remained a distant figure, always there, always watching, but rarely visible. His office was modest, his movements predictable. He walked the same path each morning, carried a packed lunch, said little, but make no mistake, every detail passed through his mind. He demanded regular reports from his managers, meticulous updates on production, shipping, expenses, profit. He studied them not with panic, but with focus. He once said, "Success comes from keeping the ears open and the mouth closed." His empire did not grow in fits of brilliance. It grew through the slow accumulation of advantage, and though he had no political office, his influence rivaled senators. Though he never fired a shot, his power was military in scope. Standard Oil was not just a company, it was a nation of steel, steam, and discipline. But with power comes suspicion. By the early 1880s, murmurs grew louder. How could one man control an entire industry? What of fairness? What of freedom? What of the thousands of jobs lost, the small businesses folded, the families displaced? The government began to stir. Journalists started to dig. Competitors plotted in the shadows. The seeds of backlash were being sown. But Rockefeller, ever calm, simply continued his work. He refined processes, diversified holdings, expanded internationally. Standard Oil opened offices in London, Shanghai, and beyond. American oil became a global force, and Standard stood at its helm. Yet even then, in his quiet reflections, Rockefeller believed he was doing right. He donated to churches, taught Sunday school, gave generously to local charities. He saw himself not as a robber baron, but a steward protecting an industry from its own worst instincts. But others disagreed, and soon those whispers would become a roar. The age of trust busting was drawing near. But for now, in the soft glow of lamplight across America, Standard Oil ruled. Unseen, unmatched, unshakable, and behind it all, the silent arithmetic of a man who had, without raising his voice, taken hold of an empire. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil was no longer a company in the conventional sense. It was a system, sprawling, intricate, and interwoven with the arteries of American commerce. From the smokestacks of Cleveland to the refineries of Philadelphia, from the oil fields of Pennsylvania to distant ports in Europe, Rockefeller's network extended in silence. Products moved, profits flowed, and the public had little idea just how much of their world now passed through his hands. But John D. Rockefeller did not like uncertainty. Though Standard Oil was enormously successful, it operated through a patchwork of companies and partnerships spread across multiple states. Each region had its own legal environment, its own competitors, its own newspapers. There was no federal incorporation law that could neatly encompass such a vast operation. And so, Rockefeller crafted a solution. In 1882, in a move of quiet brilliance, he and his top advisors created what would become one of the most influential corporate inventions in history, the Standard Oil Trust. It was simple in structure, but revolutionary in effect. All the various Standard Oil affiliates, refineries, transportation firms, marketing divisions would be placed under the control of a single board of trustees. These men, hand-picked and loyal, would make the decisions. Profits would be shared. Power would be centralized. And Rockefeller would remain the quiet center of the wheel. Legally, this trust allowed Standard Oil to bypass state laws that tried to restrict corporate expansion, where individual companies might be blocked from operating across state lines. The trust glided through those barriers like smoke through a keyhole. It was, in many ways, a corporate state. And Rockefeller was its architect. He called it cooperation. His critics called it a conspiracy, because by now, the consequences of Standard Oil's dominance were becoming impossible to ignore. Refiners who once owned their businesses found themselves as salaried managers in the Rockefeller machine. Railroads, once kingmakers, were reduced to pawns, forced to bend to Standard's demands or lose the bulk of their shipping business. Even banks, long thought untouchable, became dependent on Standard's cash flows and deposits. And behind all of it, behind the fog of subsidiaries and trustees and legal arrangements, there was always the same quiet man, reading reports by lamplight, counting barrels, considering markets. John D. Rockefeller didn't need to shout. His empire obeyed, but obedience came at a cost, and the public was beginning to sense it. It began with whispers, articles in small papers, anonymous letters, editorials penned by worried business owners. The term monopoly began to enter the American vocabulary, not as a symbol of success, but of danger. To many, Standard Oil wasn't a company anymore. It was a shadow, one that fell across farms, towns, rail yards, and government halls. And that shadow grew darker with the revelations of rebates and drawbacks. Here's how it worked. Standard Oil received secret discounts from railroads to ship its products. This was the rebate, but it also received drawbacks, which meant that for every barrel of oil its competitors shipped, Standard received a cut. Competitors were not just struggling to match prices, they were subsidizing their enemy. The public was horrified. What had seemed like free enterprise was now something else entirely: controlled commerce masquerading as competition. And while Rockefeller insisted that all of this was legal, even ethical, he saw it as the efficient evolution of industry. The mood in the country was shifting. Americans had long romanticized the self-made man, the lone entrepreneur, the frontier spirit. But Rockefeller's brand of capitalism was different. It was machine-like, calculated, clinical. People began to ask, what happens when one man controls the lifeblood of industry? What happens when profit eclipses freedom? Rockefeller did not respond. He never answered the newspapers, never testified before Congress during these years. He stayed in the background, letting others speak. His silence became part of his myth. Some saw it as arrogance, others strategy. But inside the trust, the gears kept turning. Standard Oil began to expand vertically, moving deeper into pipeline ownership, tanker fleets, and foreign markets. By owning every aspect of production, refinement, distribution, and sales, the company insulated itself from risk and maximized control. In this, Rockefeller saw a kind of beauty. He once described his work as bringing order out of chaos. He genuinely believed he had improved the industry. Kerosene was cheaper, quality was better, transportation was safer. Standard Oil's efficiency allowed prices to drop year after year, even as profits soared. And there was truth in that. But efficiency, unchecked, can become oppression. And in the shadows of Rockefeller's perfection, independent voices were being snuffed out. Thousands of small businesses had vanished. Local economies grew dependent on standard contracts. And worst of all, choice, that most sacred promise of a free market, was fading. Then came the journalists. In the 1880s and early 1890s, a new breed of writer began to emerge, men and women who called themselves muckrakers. They dug, they questioned, they followed the paper trails, and among them was one woman who would change everything, Ida Tarbell. But that part of the story will come. For now, Rockefeller remained untouchable. The trust, with its layers of control and legal cleverness, shielded him. Politicians hesitated, judges debated, and the public, still unsure whether to fear or admire him, waited. Because this was not just about oil anymore. It was about power, about the shape of modern capitalism, about how far one man's hand could reach. And John D. Rockefeller's hand now stretched across oceans. Yet, even in victory, he walked humbly, still with his Bible, still with his ledgers, still writing checks to his church, teaching Sunday school, reminding his children to be frugal and faithful. To many, it was a contradiction. To him, it was consistency, because Rockefeller believed truly that God had entrusted him with this mission, that he had been chosen to organize the chaos, that in bringing structure to an unruly world, he was doing righteous work. But beneath that belief, a history was shifting. The age of unfettered trusts was nearing its peak. And beyond that peak, storm clouds gathered. The law was awakening, and the people were watching. He never raised his voice. He never waved his fists in boardrooms, nor barked orders across factory floors. There were no grand speeches, no flamboyant gestures, no indulgent proclamations that marked the great men of business in his day. And yet, no one in the room doubted who held the power. John Davison Rockefeller was a man who controlled everything and revealed nothing. To the world outside, he seemed like a contradiction wrapped in restraint. Here was the most powerful man in America, rising before dawn to read the Bible, walking to work, packing his own lunch in a brown bag, while oil flowed like black rivers beneath his feet. He ate oatmeal, counted nickels, and taught Sunday school at the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church. He was tall and lean, with a narrow face and eyes that rarely blinked when they looked at you. His voice was soft, measured. He spoke slowly, deliberately, choosing every word as if each syllable carried weight. He did not waste breath, and when he did speak, men listened with quiet fear, not because he was cruel, but because he was inevitably right. His employees, even those closest to him, described a man of absolute control, not just over his company, but over himself. He abhorred chaos. He kept his desk spotless. His papers were always in perfect order. If a manager walked into a meeting unprepared, Rockefeller would not scold him. He would simply stare in silence until the weight of his gaze drove the lesson home. He was not the kind of tyrant that ruled by fire. He ruled by absence, a kind of disciplined vacancy that made those around him nervous. He expected excellence, not through command, but by example. One colleague recalled Rockefeller watching him sign a check for $250, then quietly saying, "I'd have done that for $200. No anger, no judgment, just the quiet reminder, every dollar matters. He kept meticulous records of his giving, his earnings, his hours, and perhaps most revealing of all, he documented his own moral inventory. In the margins of his personal notes, he would score himself on qualities like patience, meekness, firmness, self-control. Some days, he gave himself low marks. He knew his own shadows. He never drank, never smoked, rarely attended parties. He hated waste of money, of time, of emotion. Yet beneath this austere surface, there were glimpses of the man beneath the marble. He loved music, played the violin alone in the evenings, lost in notes that seemed to come from another life. He cherished his wife, Laura, a woman as private and disciplined as he was. Their relationship was one of deep respect and quiet loyalty, no flamboyant romance, just two minds bound by shared purpose. With his children, he was strict but affectionate. He kept detailed records of their allowances, taught them thrift, and reminded them always of the responsibility their family name would carry. He was not a warm father in the modern sense, but he was, in his way, devoted. And perhaps most surprising of all, he was deeply, almost superstitiously, religious. To Rockefeller, his success was not merely the result of intelligence or strategy. It was a divine gift, a stewardship. God had entrusted him with the power to shape the world, and he believed earnestly that he would one day have to account for how he used it. That belief drove everything: his discipline, his philanthropy, even his silence. And yet, for all this, the public was beginning to turn against him. By the 1890s, Rockefeller had become a symbol not of piety or precision, but of power gone unchecked. Political cartoonists drew him as an octopus, its oily tentacles wrapped around the railroads, the Congress, the globe itself. Newspapers began calling him the Oil King. Murmurs of corruption followed his name. He did not respond. He never sued for libel, never issued statements, never attended the hearings. To him, it was all noise. He had trained himself year after year to ignore distraction, to listen only to the quiet voice of purpose. But even that discipline came at a price. By middle age, Rockefeller's hair had thinned dramatically. He developed a stress-related condition known as alopecia, which caused his hair, mustache, and eyebrows to fall out entirely. His skin paled, his eyes sank slightly into his face. To many, he began to resemble a ghost, a living specter of the very industry he ruled. Thin, smooth-headed, distant, like time itself had worn him down. And yet, he kept working. Through it all: public pressure, political noise, personal strain, he remained the same, walking the same route, reviewing the same reports, tithing the same percentage of his income to his church. Because for Rockefeller, control was not just a strategy, it was a shield, a defense against the unpredictability of the world, of his father, of fate. He never spoke of his father publicly, but the shadow of Devil Bill still haunted him, that wandering swindler, that false doctor, that man who lied and vanished and left his family to pick up the pieces. Rockefeller had spent his entire life building the opposite of his father's legacy. Where Bill was chaos, John was order. Where Bill deceived, John recorded. Where Bill abandoned, John remained. And as the 20th century approached, and the American government stirred with new resolve to challenge monopolies, Rockefeller didn't blink. He had built his world brick by brick, quietly, carefully, unemotionally, and he would not abandon it now, because even if the world called him a tyrant, he believed himself a guardian, the last wall between the rising tide of greed and the clean, structured future he had always envisioned. But the walls were beginning to shake, and behind those walls, a writer named Ida Tarbell was preparing her pen. At the turn of the century, the American landscape was changing. The iron titans of industry, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, had built their castles, towering above the plains of commerce. They moved markets like gods, reshaping industries with a whisper. But the people were beginning to stir. The scent of kerosene still lingered in the air, but so did another aroma, resentment. It hung in the saloons of Pittsburgh, in the factories of Toledo, on the pages of regional newspapers. And it was growing louder, sharper, more focused. Because what once felt like prosperity was starting to feel like domination. And into this shifting wind stepped a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a relentless pen. Ida Minerva Tarbell. She wasn't loud. She wasn't brash. She didn't wear the badge of revolution. She was, by all appearances, an unlikely adversary to the most powerful man in America. But Ida had her reasons. She had grown up in Oil City, Pennsylvania, during the earliest days of the oil rush. She had seen the excitement, the opportunity, but she had also seen how those small refineries, owned by local families, had been crushed beneath the boots of Rockefeller's empire. Her own father, once an independent oilman, had been driven out of business by Standard Oil. She had lived the consequences. And now, with decades of experience as a journalist, she made a decision that would shape history. In 1902, she began publishing a series of articles in McClure's magazine, a quiet, methodical, relentless investigation titled simply The History of the Standard Oil Company. But this was no ordinary exposé. It was an epic written with the precision of a historian and the tenacity of a detective. Each article peeled back the layers of secrecy Rockefeller had spent a lifetime building. She traced his rise, uncovered his tactics, and named names. She interviewed former employees, rivals, railroad executives, bankers, anyone who had glimpsed even a piece of the puzzle. And for the first time, the American public saw the full picture. They saw how Standard Oil secured secret rebates, how it used intimidation, espionage, and economic blackmail, how it bought silence, how it built its trust not as a symbol of efficiency, but as a weapon of dominance. Tarbell never called Rockefeller a monster. She didn't need to. Her genius was in restraint, letting the facts speak with a slow, measured voice, much like Rockefeller himself. But with each installment, the quiet weight of her evidence grew heavier. And Rockefeller said nothing. He refused interviews, declined comment, maintained his routine Bible readings in the morning, ledger books at noon, violin at dusk. But those around him knew. The walls were closing in. Tarbell's articles stirred the nation. Ordinary Americans, many of whom had never understood the mechanics of oil or business trusts, suddenly saw the machinery behind their daily lives. The railroads, the kerosene lamps, the local banks, all tied to a single name, Rockefeller. She turned him from a distant figure into a tangible threat. And the backlash wasn't just public, it became political. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act had been passed, but had done little in practice. Courts hesitated. Corporations found loopholes. Rockefeller's trust had continued to grow, but now, with Tarbell's revelations fanning the flames, reformers found their voice. One of them was President Theodore Roosevelt. Though Roosevelt's energy was more often aimed at railroads and meatpacking monopolies, he recognized in Standard Oil a symbol, a target too big, too bold to ignore. In 1906, the United States government filed a formal antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Act. The wheels of justice began to grind. For years, the case dragged on arguments, appeals, hearings. Rockefeller himself was rarely seen. By this time, he was older, thinner, balder. He had stepped back from day-to-day operations, but he still held the levers of control. The court wanted to know, had Standard Oil violated the law? Had it abused its size, its influence, its secret deals? The answer came in 1911. After nearly 5 years of legal battles, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and must be dismantled. The empire was to be broken into 34 separate companies. It was one of the most significant rulings in the history of American business. The trust was shattered. But here, history leaves us with a strange irony, because breaking up Standard Oil didn't destroy Rockefeller. It made him richer. Each of those 34 companies became a new titan in its own right. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and Rockefeller, as the primary shareholder, now owned pieces of all of them. Overnight, his net worth soared. In fact, it was after the breakup that John D. Rockefeller officially became the richest man in the world. Some estimates place his wealth, adjusted for inflation, at over $400 billion. More than any modern billionaire, more than nations. And yet, through it all, he remained as he always had been, silent, focused, measuring not by the noise around him, but by the numbers in his books and the depth of his prayers. He never responded publicly to Ida Tarbell, but her work had changed him, perhaps more deeply than he let on, because after the trust was broken, Rockefeller did not rage. He turned inward. He stepped away from business almost entirely, and he began to give. By the time John D. Rockefeller was in his 70s, the world he had shaped with such deliberate care was changing beneath his feet. The roaring engines of industry now hummed with new rhythms, the trusts dismantled, and the giants of finance looking toward new horizons. But Rockefeller himself had already begun a transformation, one quieter than any refinery flame, one born not of profit, but of conscience. Though the Supreme Court had broken his empire into pieces, Rockefeller did not grieve loss. Instead, he saw opportunity, an opportunity to build not just wealth, but a different kind of influence, one that would endure beyond boardrooms and markets. He turned to philanthropy. This was no fleeting charity. It was a deliberate, methodical enterprise, just as he had run his business. Rockefeller approached giving with the same meticulous precision, careful planning, detailed accounting, and a clear mission. He believed deeply that wealth carried responsibility, that the fortunate were stewards of society's future. His first major gift came in the late 19th century to the cause of education. He funded the creation of the University of Chicago, pouring millions into its foundation. It was a bold experiment, an institution aimed at rigorous scholarship and broad access. Rockefeller saw education as a way to nurture minds capable of solving the complex problems of an industrial world. But education was only the beginning. In 1901, he established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, later renamed Rockefeller University. At a time when medical science was still in its infancy, Rockefeller invested heavily in advancing cures, treatments, and public health. He believed that just as oil could fuel machines, science could fuel progress for humanity itself. His philanthropy expanded to include funding for libraries, churches, agricultural research, and even efforts to eradicate diseases like hookworm and yellow fever in the American South. Throughout it all, Rockefeller remained deeply private. He never sought applause or headlines. Instead, he corresponded quietly with the leaders of the causes he supported, emphasizing efficiency, results, and long-term impact. Friends and family noticed the change in him. The man once driven by control now spoke often of humility and faith. He attributed his giving to a simple principle: to whom much is given, much is expected. Yet, even as his wealth swelled, thanks in part to the breakup of Standard Oil, he kept a humble lifestyle. He continued to rise early, eat simply, and live modestly. His empire had grown beyond oil, but his personal needs remained small. There was, however, a tension beneath the surface. Many wondered if his philanthropy was an attempt at redemption, a way to balance the fierce, sometimes ruthless pursuit of wealth that had marked his early years. Rockefeller never directly addressed those questions. Instead, he let his actions speak. He gave away over $500 million in his lifetime, an astronomical sum at the time. And he created foundations that would continue his work long after he was gone. In this, Rockefeller became a pioneer not just of business, but of modern philanthropy itself. Yet, the story is more complex than mere generosity, because even as he funded universities and hospitals, his name remained a lightning rod for criticism. Some believed his wealth was still tainted by monopoly and exploitation. Others feared his influence over public institutions. Still, Rockefeller persisted. He saw his fortune as a tool not just for power, but for shaping a better world. In private moments, he reflected often on his journey from a modest childhood in upstate New York through the fires of industry to this moment of quiet legacy. He wrote letters to his children, reminding them that true success lay not in dollars, but in character and service. And as the sun set on his life, Rockefeller embraced the paradox of a man who had amassed unimaginable wealth, yet sought to leave behind a world improved not by dominance, but by giving. He died in 1937, aged 97, leaving behind not just an empire divided, but a legacy woven into the fabric of American education, medicine, and philanthropy. A legacy born from oil, yes, but refined by conscience. And so, as you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine the quiet hum of refineries giving way to the gentle turning pages of books, the soft murmur of research labs, and the hopeful footsteps of children in schools built by a man who once ruled an empire in shadow, but chose to step into the light. John D. Rockefeller passed away in 1937, a man whose life spanned nearly a century that bore witness to the birth of modern industry and the profound transformation of America itself. But what exactly is left behind when a titan such as he departs? When we speak of Rockefeller today, the story is rarely simple. It is a narrative woven from contradictions of immense wealth and deep philanthropy, ruthless ambition and quiet restraint, public vilification and private generosity. The world remembers him as the first billionaire, the architect of Standard Oil, the robber baron to some, and a saintly benefactor to others. Yet, beneath these titles lies a man who embodied the complexities of progress itself, the cost and the promise. His legacy is etched not only in the sprawling corporations that emerged from Standard Oil's dissolution, but in the very structure of American capitalism. The trust, once a symbol of monopolistic might, became a catalyst for the modern regulatory state. It forced the nation to grapple with questions that remain urgent to this day. How much power should a single corporation wield? What responsibilities come with vast wealth? And how can society balance innovation with fairness? These questions continue to echo as contemporary giants grapple with scrutiny and calls for reform. Rockefeller's life offers a prism through which we can examine these enduring tensions. His story is also a reminder of the profound impact that discipline, faith, and vision can have not only on markets, but on the social fabric. He was a man who controlled his impulses, measured his actions, and saw his fortune as a trust to be managed, not merely enjoyed. His philanthropy laid the groundwork for institutions that have saved lives, educated generations, and pushed the boundaries of knowledge. Yet, the shadow of monopoly and the means by which his fortune was amassed still provoke debate. Was his pursuit of wealth a necessary engine of progress, or a harsh squeeze on competitors and consumers? History rarely offers easy answers. But what is undeniable is the story of a man who rose from modest means, faced the ghosts of his past, and built a legacy both vast and intricate. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine the quiet reflection of a figure whose life was as much about control of self and circumstance as it was about power. A man who knew the price of ambition, but also the possibility of redemption, who taught us that wealth is not just accumulation, but stewardship, and that even in the darkest nights, there is space for light. Behind the towering edifice of Standard Oil, behind the vast empire and public scrutiny, stood a man who was, above all, a husband and father. John D. Rockefeller's family was his sanctuary, a place where the relentless currents of business and ambition paused to meet the gentle rhythms of home. He married Laura Celestia Seti Spellman in 1864, a woman whose strength was often the quiet counterpoint to his measured intensity. Laura was deeply committed to faith and philanthropy herself, sharing Rockefeller's belief that wealth carried a sacred responsibility. Together, they raised 5 children: Elizabeth, Alice, Alta, Edith, and John Jr. Their household was a place of order, discipline, and education. Rockefeller was a strict father, expecting his children to learn the value of thrift, hard work, and integrity. Yet he was also deeply involved in their upbringing, writing letters, advising, and teaching lessons that went beyond mere money. He encouraged them to lead lives of service, to use their privileges wisely. The family was bound by a shared sense of purpose. Yet, as with any family, there were complexities beneath the surface. John Jr., his only son, was groomed to take over the family business. He stepped into the role with a different style, more diplomatic, more public-facing, navigating the challenges left by his father's legacy. His daughters also pursued philanthropy and social causes, continuing the tradition of giving that defined the Rockefellers. Together, the family formed one of the most influential dynasties in American history, its name associated not only with oil and wealth, but with education, medicine, and culture. But family life was not immune to the pressures of immense power. The Rockefellers maintained a strict code of privacy, shielding themselves from the glare of public attention whenever possible. Even as their name became synonymous with fortune, they sought to cultivate humility and responsibility. Through letters and diaries, we glimpse moments of tenderness, Rockefeller reading bedtime stories, family dinners, quiet walks, offering a humanizing portrait of a man often seen only as a titan. Their story reminds us that behind the legacies of history lie personal relationships, fragile, enduring, and deeply human. As you drift further into sleep, imagine a quiet household where the pulse of industry slows to the steady beat of family, love, and faith. A world where the greatest power is found not in wealth, but in connection. The dawn of the 20th century marked not only the twilight of John D. Rockefeller's personal empire, but also the birth of a new era for American industry. The breakup of Standard Oil shattered a monopoly, but it also unleashed forces that would redefine commerce and innovation across the nation. From the ashes of a giant, countless companies rose, some destined to become household names, others quietly powering industries behind the scenes. Oil remained at the heart of this transformation, but new technologies and industries began to flourish: automobiles, electricity, steel, and telecommunications. Rockefeller's careful control had given way to a more dynamic, if sometimes chaotic, landscape. Regulation and reform followed suit. The government, once hesitant, began to take a more active role in overseeing competition and protecting consumers. Antitrust laws were sharpened, corporate practices scrutinized, and the balance between business power and public good sought with renewed vigor. In this environment, entrepreneurs found fresh opportunities, but also new challenges. They had to navigate an increasingly complex world where innovation raced ahead and public expectations grew. Meanwhile, Rockefeller's descendants adapted to these changes, diversifying interests and expanding philanthropic efforts, embedding themselves in the fabric of American society. The industrial age was no longer defined by single titans, but by networks of influence and cooperation. This evolution also raised questions about the nature of capitalism itself. How could growth be sustained without sacrificing fairness? How might innovation serve all rather than a few? The story of Rockefeller thus became a touchstone, a reminder of both the possibilities and perils of vast wealth and concentrated power. As night deepens around you, picture the relentless motion of progress, the factories humming, the trains rushing, the oil pumping, an endless flow of energy, ambition, and change. And in that current, a legacy that remains as alive and complex as ever. John D. Rockefeller's story is not just a chapter in history. It is a blueprint, a pattern that continues to shape how great wealth is built, managed, and given away. His meticulous approach to accumulating wealth, paired with his pioneering spirit in philanthropy, set standards that modern billionaires still follow. He taught that vast fortunes come with profound responsibility. The foundations he established became models of transparency, efficiency, and long-term vision, influencing organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and many others. Rockefeller's legacy reminds us that philanthropy is not merely an act of charity, but a deliberate strategy to address society's deepest challenges. Today's philanthropists often echo his belief in funding education, medical research, and public health causes that ripple through generations. But his life also serves as a cautionary tale about the risks of unchecked power and the importance of ethical stewardship. In a world where wealth can seem both a blessing and a burden, Rockefeller's journey invites reflection on the balance between ambition and compassion. As you settle deeper into calm, imagine the gentle ripple of influence spreading across decades, a river of change flowing from one man's vision to the hopes and efforts of millions. John D. Rockefeller's name carries a weight that extends far beyond history books and business records. Over the decades, his story has woven itself into American folklore, shrouded in both admiration and suspicion. Legends paint him as a ruthless robber baron, a man whose hunger for wealth knew no bounds. Others describe him as a visionary philanthropist, a man who transformed society through generous giving. These stories, some true, some exaggerated, are part of his enduring mystique. There are tales of Rockefeller's legendary thriftiness, how he clipped coupons, how he insisted on a modest lifestyle despite unimaginable wealth. Some see this as evidence of discipline and humility, others as a paradox that fascinates and puzzles. Then there are stories of his famous Bible readings and violin playing small windows into the quiet man behind the empire. But myths also cloud the man. Some accuse him of monopolistic cruelty, using secret deals and ruthless tactics to destroy competition. And while Tarbell's exposé revealed much, the full truth remains complex. This mystique, the interplay of fact and legend, reflects something deeper, a collective grappling with what great power means and how we reconcile immense success with human flaws. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine sitting by a fire, listening to stories told in whispers, stories that carry both the light and shadow of a man who changed a nation. A man who, in his silence and ambition, became a legend. As the night deepens and your breath slows, we pause together to reflect on the journey we have taken through the life of John D. Rockefeller, a man of vast contrasts, tireless ambition, and quiet generosity. His story teaches us about the power of vision to build, to change, to endure. But it also reminds us of the human cost of such power and the importance of humility and responsibility. Rockefeller's life is a mirror, reflecting the complex dance between wealth and conscience, ambition and service. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson is this: that legacy is not simply the sum of one's riches or achievements, but the lasting impact we leave on others, the ways we choose to shape the world beyond ourselves. As you drift into sleep, imagine the steady flame of a lantern, a guiding light through the night. A light that flickers not from oil or fire alone, but from the choices of a man who lived fully, struggled deeply, and gave generously. May this story lull you gently, inspiring quiet thoughts of purpose and peace. Thank you for sharing this time. Until next we meet, rest well.